Welcome to Searcy Uva. In early 1952, Ernesto Che Guevara and his friend Alberto Granado embarked on a motorcycle journey throughout Latin America. Beginning in Argentina, they traveled to Chile, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela, Panama, and Miami, Florida, before returning home to Argentina. Along their journey, they encountered many different American Indian tribes, historical landmarks of previous empires, met with persecuted communists, spoke to doctors, and met oppressed workers in the Chilean mines, among many other significant events. These events he wrote about in the Motorcycle Diaries act as a post-colonial memoir, while retaining his original intention of it being a travel diary. Latin America's history is a mix of American Indian empires and European colonization by the Spanish and Portuguese, which subsequently dominated the continent. Guevara, being of Spanish and Irish heritage, was an Argentine national. As he articulates in the book, Argentina was the promised land in the eyes of many people he interacted with in neighbouring countries. Due to this stark difference in living standards, personal hygiene, health system differences, and working conditions, he was shocked by the circumstances he saw throughout his journey and later advocated for a continent-wide liberation from the colonial capitalist order. This research project's question is thus, how does Che Guevara's character influence his compassionate outlook towards the people of colonial Latin America? The literature for the Motorcycle Diaries book is overshadowed by the vast wealth of academic work on the better-known movie version. In the book's academic literature, the articles pointed to two main themes, the Chilean situation and the theme of travel as personal change. To understand how the situation in Chile occurred, it is important that I first describe the rationalization of colonialism. Blaut, 1989, describes, from a Marxist perspective, the link between and how the rise of global capitalism and colonization occurred, through Europe's diffusion throughout the world, which he describes as Eurocentric diffusionism. This process allows for Europe to first progress and modernize, while the rest of the world initially remains stagnant, traditional, and unchanging. He says that the reason this progressive cultural evolution occurred was due to factors that are intellectual and/or spiritual. Progress then comes to non-Europe through a diffusion of European ideas, institutions, and people. Since it was the Spanish and Portuguese that colonized Latin America, it was their ideas, faith, and language that they brought with them and established over the indigenous culture. Uzosi 2003 explains that the reason why Spain and Portugal led Europe in exploration and interaction with West Africa and Latin America was due to their locational advantage. Their proximity to early civilizations like Egypt, Greece, Crete, and the Moors of North Africa provided them their stimulus for exploration. Central Europe, the northern countries, and the British Isles were far from those countries because of the physical land barriers that the Alpine region presented them. But, during the Moorish occupation of the Iberian Peninsula, the Moors maintained a vast library on astronomy and navigation, which helped with teaching the Spanish and Portuguese that the oceans weren't barriers but acted as highways for sea power and commerce. This then empowered them to colonize parts of the world and form an empire. Despite being of northern Spanish and partial Irish heritage, it is understandable how Guevara would oppose the colonial legacy that Spain and Portugal have left on Latin America, as he was Argentinian by nationality. His Argentinian nationality and identity would partially remove his cultural connection to Europe, leaving him with his ethnicity, choosing instead to embrace his Argentinianness. This removed an acceptance of colonialism, as Latin Americans were the colonial receivers, not masters. Perhaps feeling some guilt, but mainly empathy for the situation his fellow Latin Americans were in, over his settler colonial paradigm, Guevara's empathy during the motorcycle journey is evidently due to his medical background and middle-class family's wealth. Speed 2017 articulates how the situation differed between the Anglophone North and the Iberian South's colonization. The North focused on land dispossession and elimination of the natives through manifest destiny, while in the South the focus was resource extraction and the marshalling and control of indigenous labour. In Wolf's 1999 divide between land and labour, Guevara's family would have fallen on the side of land due to his Spanish heritage and middle-class wealth, as most of the oppressed workers he interacted with were either American Indians or mestizos. This paradigm is echoed in Ashcroft, Griffiths, and Tiffin's theory of imperialist binarism, where Guevara assumed the human, doctor, colonizer, and beautiful roles, and the people he interacted with were bestial, patient, colonized, and ugly. Now that the historical context has been explained, this section will discuss what Guevara experienced in Chile, how it changed him, and what the Chilean living situation was. Firstly, Pinto 2009 recalls how Guevara became a different person to himself before the journey. The themes that the literature discuss can be intertwined, since the Motorcycle Diaries' progression strongly indicate a change in perspective and an eventual radicalization in the latter part of the book's first half. Pinto explains this radicalization and the adoption of the Che persona by stating, at the start of his trip, Guevara was just Ernesto Guevara, the 23-year-old medical student from Argentina, training to enter the Argentine bourgeoisie. The purpose of the diaries was a description of two lives that were together with a common aim, to experience what Latin America had to offer and study leprology. The journey would soon change him into Che, the communist revolutionary. Pinto then compares Chile to Peru by saying, although in Chile they had a few free hospitals with poorly lit operating theatres, this was accompanied by general dirtiness, no sanitation in the toilets, and few medical instruments, meaning their problems arose through infrastructure and organisation, also evident by observing the working conditions of miners. The situation in Peru was worse and fundamental, something that doesn't get much attention in the academic literature, as it began at the level of the individual. While he was travelling to Machu Picchu, Guevara had noticed that the indigenous population had poor hygiene, which resulted in infections. He reasoned that this was the main reason for the terrible living conditions in Peru. Ching, Buckley, and Lozano Alonso describe the irony of what Che Guevara's legend has become. His character and silhouette have been romanticized and mythologized into a cultural icon on red t-shirts. Edgy teens who don't know the truth about who Che Guevara was then purchase, consume, and identify with it. In many ways, he is no longer a person of historical significance, but a commodity to be consumed and integrated into your identity. The beliefs that Guevara held, and the neoliberal rebel without a cause outlook teens who buy these shirts likely hold, are strongly at odds with each other, making them theoretical enemies. Yet this falsified legend persists. They further describe how in the post-World War II period, fascism and National Socialism were no longer additional anti-capitalist alternatives, as the Allied victory with the war machine that was the Soviet Union over the Axis powers came to dominate Eastern Europe and inspire change throughout the rest of the world. This change had reached Latin America in the late 1940s and early 1950s with the failure of populist nationalism on behalf of former Argentinian President Juan Perón, among others in the region. In an Australian context, I see a significant overlap between the mythologies of Che Guevara and Ned Kelly, as they were men of and for the people. Despite being politically polarized, the legend of Che Guevara became a consumer object to demonstrate your anti-establishment views and non-conformist attitude, while Ned Kelly's legend has been sadly reduced to his final words, "Such is life," a simple catchphrase made into bumper stickers or tattoos. Moreover, his iconic bulletproof suit of armor, which he wore in his final shootout against the police, has become a costume and an easily recognizable piece of street art. This shows the sad transformation of society into an economic zone of consumption instead of a nation with an identity where we learn about our heroes in history. Neither men would appreciate their legacy being reduced to what they've become. Additionally, their legacies in the public eye don't include their political philosophies or mention the struggles and triumphs they experienced before their fame. In this way, they both share an Irish connection, anti-colonial ideas, and anti-establishment, thus anti-capitalist sentiments. While Ned Kelly advocated along racial lines for Australianism against Angloism, for the Australian working class people against the capitalist establishment from British colonialism, Guevara similarly, although holding a different political philosophy altogether, advocated along class lines for Latin American continentalism. This was underscored by Marxist theory against European colonialism, for the Latin American proletariat against European colonialist capitalism. Ashcroft, Griffiths, and Tiffin outline how one of the main features of imperial oppression stems from a control of language. The standardizing methods an imperial education system utilizes can instill their metropolitan language. In Australia, it was British English instead of the so-called impure variant of Australian English, as to be colonial is to talk Australian slang, to be everything that is abominable. In the Latin American context, the impure variants were the indigenous languages and cultures which Guevara tried to understand and appreciate, viewing them instead of a new phenomenon waiting to flourish as was the case in Australia, but a lavish history of defunct empires. Moreover, he viewed the people as browbeaten and their empires and histories as snuffed out by Spain and Portugal's domination of the continent. Ashcroft, Griffith, and Tiffin's theory of imperialist binarism is interesting to connect here to the standardizing of language, with either men sitting on opposing sides of the binary. This is familiar to people like myself that advocate for nationhood and self-determination. Language becomes a medium through which a hierarchical structure of power is perpetuated, and how conceptions of truth, order, and reality become established. The effective post-colonial, anti-establishment, or revolutionary voice thus rejects this power. A New York Times best-selling book and subsequent adaptation into a revered movie, The Motorcycle Diaries, although it is overshadowed by the movie version, still functions as a book that is suitable to many genres, maintaining a rating of 3.8 out of 5 stars, with over 29,000 ratings and 1,700 plus reviews. This post-colonial text helps the reader understand the man Guevara was and the man he became, effectively removing the veil of mythology that currently surrounds him. In conclusion, Che Guevara's high status in the eyes of his fellow Latin Americans as an Argentinian of Spanish heritage gave him the appearance of prestige since Argentina was so prosperous compared to other Latin American countries. This became apparent to Guevara and does to the reader the further you get into his motorcycle journey, as he became politically conscious and became an activist and revolutionary for his people. Guevara's Argentinian identity is partly responsible for his view of colonialism and capitalism, and subsequent transformation through travel. The other factor is Guevara's training as a medical student and the innate care that such an occupation denotes in a person. This unique character of his lends a hand to the development of a compassionate, sympathetic outlook for the have-nots of Latin American society. After his death, Guevara, like Ned Kelly, was mythologized and became a cultural icon for the uninformed, edgy, anti-establishment young adult demographic, who Guevara would likely view as enemies. This post-colonial text successfully shows us how legends either die young and become a mythologized, falsified version of their true self, or they become an evil boogeyman. Hey, thanks for reading this article. Watch this space, as there will be plenty more to come.